1944 was the year when the war began to devour its own creators. Europe was a continent of smoke and silence, its fields turned to mud, its cities reduced to ghosts. In the Bavarian foothills, far from the front lines, a small village worked beneath the illusion of peace. The church bell still rang every morning, and the river still froze in perfect silence, yet everyone knew that the sound of the world was dying. At the edge of that village stood a workshop that once repaired plows and harvesters. Now it forged steel for the Reich. The men who worked there no longer spoke of victory. They spoke only of deadlines and shortages, of coal that arrived damp and tools that broke too easily. Otto Keller managed the shop. His beard was white with dust, his eyes sharp from years of measuring distance in fractions of a millimeter. He had been told that the future of the fatherland depended on precision, that every bolt and bearing mattered. Yet power failures cut the machines mid-shift, and the cold stiffened his fingers until the tools slipped. On a morning thick with fog, Otto's apprentice, young Franz, adjusted the milling arm of the main lathe. The gear it cut was part of a transmission destined for a panzer division near Warsaw. When the blade struck a burr, Franz steadied it by feel rather than sight. The sound changed by a tone so slight it vanished under the hum of the belts. No one noticed. The defect measured less than the width of a hair. By noon, the radio droned through the static, promising that new secret weapons would soon crush the Allies. Otto turned the volume lower. Outside, snow fell without wind, burying the tracks of the last army truck that had come for spare parts. Inside, the men packed the gears into wooden crates, lined with paper, stamped urgent. The error sat hidden among them like a seed waiting for its season. That evening, Otto locked the door and stepped into the frozen street. Smoke from the forge drifted upward, disappearing into the gray sky. He thought of his son somewhere on the Eastern Front, and of the silence between their last letters. Behind him, the machines cooled, ticking softly as the metal shrank. The mistake slept inside the crate, small and perfect. Within weeks, it would be carried hundreds of kilometers to the heart of the German war machine. There, beneath the roar of engines and the orders of men who never touched the tools that built their empire, that single flaw would begin to turn, and the war would start to break from within. The crates left the village before dawn, stacked in the back of a truck that groaned beneath its own rust. Snow fell in thick waves, muting the sound of the engine as it climbed the narrow road toward the main depot. Otto watched from his doorway until the red taillights disappeared into the fog. He felt an emptiness he could not name, as if something of himself had gone with that cargo. The men of the workshop returned to their benches, pretending that the war outside had no doorway into their small world. But every hammer strike echoed differently now, dull and distant, like a heartbeat that had begun to slow. 3 weeks later, far to the east, those same crates were opened inside a maintenance shed outside Warsaw. The smell of oil and gasoline filled the air as mechanics hurried to repair a column of tanks preparing for the front. The ground trembled each time the engines roared to life. Inside one of those steel beasts, the defective gear found its place. It turned smoothly at first, polished by grease and heat. The soldiers driving it never imagined that a single flaw the size of a splinter would become their undoing. By February, temperatures had plunged below freezing. The German divisions moved through endless snow, metal screaming under strain. At dawn on the third day of advance, one tank coughed and stalled, then another. Within an hour, half the column stood silent in the white wasteland. The engines had seized, their transmissions locked tight. No one could explain it. Officers shouted, mechanics cursed, men froze beside the dead machines. When they opened the casings, they saw the teeth of the gears fractured clean through. The steel had sheared itself apart as if it had lost the will to turn. In the distance, Soviet artillery began to speak. The first shells landed close enough to shake the ice from the branches. Panic spread through the immobilized column. Crews abandoned their tanks and ran for the tree line. Smoke curled upward where fire met fuel. Within hours, the road was littered with burned metal and the smell of defeat. Reports later claimed sabotage, but no proof was found. No one thought of the small workshop hidden among the Bavarian hills, or of the tired hands that shaped those gears. Back in the village, Otto never learned what had happened. He only noticed that the orders stopped coming. The silence that followed felt heavier than any winter before it. At night, the radio no longer promised victory. It spoke of retreat, of broken lines, of cities lost one by one. Otto sat by the window, listening to the wind slip through the cracks, and wondered if his work had mattered at all. Somewhere far away, in the ruins of the Eastern Front, his mistake had already answered that question. The winter of 1945 arrived without warning, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to change. The village lay buried beneath snow that swallowed the fences and chimneys. The forge had gone cold weeks ago. No trains came, no trucks passed, and the silence grew thick enough to hear one's own heartbeat. Otto Keller spent his morning sweeping frost from his tools, though there was no work left to do. The last order from the army had been canceled. Rumors whispered through the valley that the war was nearing its end, that the Americans were crossing the Rhine, that the East had collapsed. No one celebrated. Everyone waited for footsteps on the road, for engines that did not arrive. At night, the radio spoke in broken sentences, filled with static and half-truths. Otto kept it low so his wife could sleep. Each message sounded smaller, more desperate, like a man shouting through smoke. The portraits on the wall, leaders who once promised victory, now seemed to watch the room with hollow eyes. Otto remembered the crates, the gears, the day they left under the falling snow. Sometimes he dreamed of them grinding against each other in endless darkness, breaking, scattering, silencing machines miles away. He did not know if that thought brought him pride or guilt. One morning the church bell rang for the first time in months. A soldier from the retreating army had arrived with a broken motorcycle and a letter for the mayor. The man's face was gray with frostbite. He said that the Eastern Front had collapsed because of mechanical failures, because tanks had frozen and transmissions had shattered. He spoke the words quietly as though they were secrets. Otto listened from the doorway of his shop, feeling the air leave his chest. A thought flickered. Could a mistake that small have reached so far? He pushed it away, yet it returned each time the wind rose. By March, the distant thunder of artillery could be felt beneath the ground. The villagers buried their valuables in the fields. Children hid in cellars. Each evening, a faint glow reddened the horizon. When the first Allied patrol finally entered the valley, they found a place that had already surrendered to exhaustion. No one resisted. The soldiers moved carefully through the streets, rifles lowered, eyes scanning the silent houses. Otto stood outside his workshop as they passed. One of them glanced at the rusting sign above the door, then nodded without a word. That night the snow melted for the first time in months. Water dripped from the roof into the forge, hissing against the cold metal. Otto sat alone beside the extinguished furnace. In the distance, church bells rang again, this time not for warning, but for ending. He realized that the war which had consumed the world had also ended inside his small shop long before anyone noticed. The mistake that had left his hands months ago had done what no general or weapon could. It had stopped the machines meant to conquer everything. By the time the Allies reached the village, the war had already been fought and lost in ways no one could fully explain. The soldiers who passed through were men who had seen things beyond the reach of stories, yet even they seemed lost in this quiet corner of the world. There were no battles to win here, only hushed conversations and hands that had spent too many years bending to war. Otto stood by his workshop, feeling the weight of silence pressing against him. The streets, once filled with the sound of hurried footsteps, now felt like a memory fading with every breath he took. The next days blurred in a fog of routine that felt empty, as if the world had stopped before the final blow had landed. The villagers, once so divided by loyalty and fear, now found something between them: grief. No one spoke of victories or defeats. No one spoke of what had happened in the east. Only the sound of the wind through the trees reminded them that something had passed, something they could never return to. Otto never saw the letter. It came days after the last soldier had left. His wife had kept it hidden, a reminder of the last days of a broken empire. It was addressed to the workshop, but the return address was different, a location no one had heard of. A military command far from their quiet corner of the world. Inside, the words were sharp, clear, and strange. The failure of mechanical equipment during the Eastern Campaign has been traced back to faulty gear production originating from small-scale civilian workshops. Investigations are ongoing. The letter ended with a name Otto did not recognize, but the words themselves struck him like a blow he had been waiting for without knowing it. Otto read it again, slowly, as if trying to find a way to undo the meaning within those lines. He thought of the gears, the small flaw in the metal, the way it seemed so insignificant back in that workshop. How easily it had been overlooked. How easily it had been sent on its way. The thought that the failure of his hands could have reached across the vast stretches of a continent, bringing a halt to the war machinery, seemed too large to hold. He had not seen it then. Perhaps no one had. The scale of a war, after all, does not always appear on a map. Sometimes it is hidden in the smallest corners of a broken workshop, in a mistake that cannot be undone. The years passed. The village rebuilt itself quietly, like so many others in Europe, mending the wounds that had been left by the long years of war. Otto grew older, his hands slow but still steady as he worked with wood and metal. The war faded into the background of his life, though its shadow never quite left him. He thought of his son sometimes, wondering if he had survived the fight. He thought of the tanks, the soldiers, the names he would never know. He thought of the workshop and how, despite all that had happened, it had never truly left him. It was a memory now, buried beneath the dirt and rust of time. But it was also a truth, and truths do not fade quickly. They settle, waiting for someone to look at them and remember. When Otto passed away many years later, the village continued to move forward. The war had become history, part of a past that was gradually replaced by the everyday rhythms of a world that could never be the same. But in the records, in the old archives that no one cared to read, there was still a trace of that mistake. A note in the margins of a report, a forgotten error that had changed the course of a war. Perhaps it was a fitting end, no medal, no grand monument. Just a small moment, a mistake that lived and died quietly, like everything else that had been lost in those years. The village remained silent, as it had before the war, as it had during the war and now after it. Only the wind and the passing seasons held the stories of what had been. The gears, the tanks, the soldiers, they were all gone. But the silence of that small workshop remained. A constant reminder that even the smallest acts of failure can reshape the world in ways no one ever imagines.